And as we begin the opening ceremonies, please now join me in welcoming the 2014 NMUN Secretary General, Thara Watson.
Honorable delegates, faculty advisors, members of the NCCA board, and distinguished guests, welcome to the National Model United Nations New York 2014 conference. Before I give my opening remarks and open the conference, I have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker. Ambassador Thomas Mayr Harting took up his post as head of the EU delegation to the UN in New York in October 2011. He previously served as the permanent representative of Austria to the United Nations while Austria was a member of the Security Council. He also served as vice president of the 66th General Assembly. Mr. Mayr Harting joined the Austrian diplomatic service more than 30 years ago. In his distinguished career, he has served in senior levels of the foreign ministry, including Director General for Political Affairs, as well as post in Brussels, ambassador to Belgium, and head of the Austrian mission to NATO, and in Moscow. From 2002 to 2004, Mr. Mayr Harting acted as special representative of the Austrian foreign minister to the Western Balkans. Mr. Mayr Harting received his law degree at the University of Vienna, and he went on to study European law at the College of Europe. And he received his diploma at the Hague Academy of International Law. We are honored tonight to have with him his wife and children. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Ambassador Thomas Mayr Harting, head of the EU delegation to the United Nations.
Madam Secretary General, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, you see I also still have to get used to the procedures of the Model United Nations. I'm impressed by the incredible numbers that are here today, and they say that the young generation is not interested in politics, not interested in international relations, not interested in the United Nations. I think you're proving the opposite here and in the days to come. I'm sure you'll bring a breath of fresh air to proceedings here in the United Nations. You know that we're criticized sometimes for these long working hours until the early morning, and when we are told we only produce hot air and waste a lot of time, and all this for non-binding resolutions. But I have to tell you, this work until the early morning hours is quite useful from time to time. We had such a session coincidentally in the night from Friday to Saturday. It only ended at 7 in the morning, and it was in the Commission on Population and Development. And they discussed essential issues. They discussed about the link between population, gender equality, fighting HIV/AIDS, and development, sustainable development. And there were many who didn't want to have this language, and it was well worth fighting for this language and have it in the text. And you'll do these things in the resolutions and in the text that you will work for in the days to come. I'll just give you one example, and I found it in the impressive list of subjects that you're going to tackle in these next days, and that is fighting violence against women. And people will tell you, and I suppose some of you, many of you, with the masses represented here, will be representing countries which say there are cultural differences in the world and there are values that are interpreted differently in different parts of the world. But the main point about the United Nations is that it's a universal organization. There was an ambassador to the United Nations, a US ambassador, John Bolton, who once said that such a thing as the United Nations didn't exist. But the reality is, this is an organization about universality and about universal values. And I can tell you, the Secretary General, the acting Secretary General of the United Nations, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, said the following just a few months ago: there's one universal truth applicable to all countries, cultures, and communities. Violence against women is never acceptable, never excusable, never tolerable. That's the sort of language that the United Nations works for. there was another great secretary of the United Nations, the second secretary of the United Nations, Dag Hammarskjld. When they elected him, they thought they were electing a grey bureaucrat, and they were quite surprised, the members of the Security Council afterwards, that they got one of the strongest personalities in the history of the United Nations. And he once said, the United Nations was not created to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. And that is true, but it is also true 20 years after the genocide of Rwanda, 19 years after the massacre of Srebrenica, that the United Nations has not always been able even to prevent hell. And that's why we have to continue to work for peace, for international security, and for understanding among people. And today we are facing new challenges. We are facing what is basically military aggression in Ukraine. We are facing the bloodshed in Syria. And you may still ask yourself what the United Nations is doing to cope about these major challenges. And it is true. Tonight again, the Security Council will meet in 2 hours from now to discuss the situation in eastern Ukraine. And again, I'm sure we will not find a solution. But the United Nations Security Council, the General Assembly, they are also the conscience of the world. And just a few days ago, the General Assembly of the United Nations voted with 100 votes in favor against 11 to support the sovereignty, political independence, unity, territorial integrity of Ukraine. We have a long way to go to ensure this, but this is also a message that this organization stands for and that we defend. Let me also say that I was impressed by the list of many subjects that you'll tackle. One of the subjects, for instance, I found in your long list was peacekeeping and maintaining peace in Western Africa. You may well ask yourselves, many of you, why Western Africa? Why is peace in Western Africa important for us? If you look, for instance, at the challenge of drugs trafficking, you know where the drugs originate, many of them. Part of them in Afghanistan, others in Latin America, and they are smuggled across the Atlantic Ocean, through Central America, through the Caribbean, to states, failed states in Western Africa, and from there to the Sahel, to Europe, to the customers, to the consumers of these drugs. So the drugs originate in one part of the world, they are consumed in other parts of the world, but if we don't make peace in Western Africa, we will not be able to interrupt this chain of drug trafficking that takes drugs into our own countries. And therefore, the United Nations is also doing a lot of work in Africa. The United Nations is dealing with a forgotten crisis, the crisis that others would never take care of. Dag Hammarskjld, whom I already mentioned, died, in fact, in a plane crash when he tried to bring peace to Congo, and we're still fighting for peace and security in the Democratic Republic of Congo 50 years later. But it is a work that nobody else is doing. People complain about the lot of money that goes into United Nations peacekeeping. It's true, the United Nations spends $7 billion, soon $8 billion per year on its peacekeeping operation. With these 8 billions, with this budget of 8 billion, it maintains more than 100,000, nearly 120,000 peacekeepers, soldiers and policemen across the world. And it's not a big sum if you think that the annual defense budget of the United States is $700 billion. With 1% of the US defense budget, the United Nations maintains peace with 100,000 blue helmets across the world. And that is something you should also reflect on when you work here in the days to come. You will also deal with other subjects. You will deal with sustainable development. You will ask the right sort of questions. One of the questions I found in your list is development, social and economic development, and the rule of law. How can there be social development without fighting corruption? And again, this is a universal issue. It's not an issue linked to certain countries in the world, to certain parts of the world. It's an issue linked to our, if I may speak as a European, Western part of the world, but also to other countries. We have to take care of this universally, and again, for this you need a universal organization. And there are other issues, monitoring, implementing the Sustainable Development Goals, and all these other subjects that you will deal with. I just say a word, because I thought you might be interested about what I do here and why I have been asked to introduce this session as the head of delegation of the European Union. Why does the European Union have an ambassador in the United Nations? May I ask you who in this room is European, who comes from a member state of the European Union? So you see, it's quite a sizable group and a high percentage. So welcome to all members of the European Union member states. But all of your countries here have their own missions, have their own ambassadors. I meet on a weekly basis with my 28 colleagues, the ambassadors of the European Union member states, and I chair their weekly coordination meetings. And you'll be surprised to hear that in the course of a year, we have something not only at ambassadorial level, but at the level of the various diplomatic levels that we have in our mission, something like 1,000 coordination meetings per year to coordinate our positions here. We speak as a group, we speak individually, but we also speak as a group representing 500 million people, 7% of the world population, but representing nearly 40% of the budget of the United Nations, 37% of the budget of the United Nations, of the peacekeeping budget, and more than 50% of world development aid. And this is also something that you will learn in the days to come, the importance of groups and the importance of coordination amongst groups and the importance of speaking with one voice. I will not hold you for much longer. I will not hold you up with your important work. You will discover that perhaps part of what you're doing is more exciting than some of the work that we have to do on a daily basis. It's sometimes a lot of things that happen in multilateral organization are things that cannot be simulated in the conference room that quite easily. Meetings with wheelers and dealers, trying to find out what's going on. That's one of the greatest challenges of multilateral diplomacy, that you know what's happening, that you have the right sort of information at the moment when people are drafting texts that they don't want to show to you yet. Meet people in the corridors, move things forward, go on with your work. The European Union deals with what we call a comprehensive approach. We support the United Nations in the field of peacekeeping. We have peacekeeping operations like the one in the Central African Republic that we're building up, that we're running for the United Nations. We deal with development, we deal with social development. We're probably the greatest donor of humanitarian aid in the world. And you should also have this comprehensive approach in your work, because this is a comprehensive approach to human rights, to social development, to democracy. That is something the United Nations stands for as well. You will have a number of very exciting days ahead of you now. And at the end of these days, I understand you will meet again in your closing sessions. And I gather that you're so many that you will have to have 3 consecutive closing sessions in the General Assembly Hall, because the General Assembly Hall, the provisional one, is only to house all of you if you come in 3 consecutive sessions. And even then, you will find that it's much fuller than it sometimes is when your professional colleagues go there. And probably it will also be more enthusiastic when you go there than when we are there from time to time. You know, one of the things the United Nations does is fighting contagious diseases. But I can tell you, enthusiasm is also contagious. So I hope you'll transmit this enthusiasm to everyone here at the United Nations. Good luck and have a wonderful time.
Thank you, Ambassador Mayr Harting. The ambassador has graciously agreed to take questions. When we learned that the ambassador would entertain questions, NMUN randomly selected 8 schools and invited them to choose a delegate to sit near the front and be near the microphone and be prepared if time allowed. At this time, I'll invite the first 3 questions, and then we'll check to see if there's time for more. I'd ask that the delegates pre-selected come to the audience microphone seated here. Please introduce yourself by name, country representing here at NMUN, your home country, and your school, and briefly state your question. As is customary in the UN, we will ask the questions in succession, since often themes intertwine in the response. Please, the first question.
Honorable Ambassador Mayr Harting, thank you for this opportunity. My name is Stefan Buchberger. My delegation and I are representing Myanmar, and we are studying at Johannes Kepler University in Linz, Austria. The question is following. Could there arise further conflicts in countries bordering Russia because of the dependence whether to the Russian Federation or the European Union? And if so, which sanctions are imaginable for the United Nations?
Hello, my name is Anthony Skedulewski. I am from Ursinus College in Collegeville, Pennsylvania, so from the United States. My question is, do you foresee in the near future any changes to the EU's immigration policies? Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Šárka Ševčíková. I am from the Czech Republic, Palacký University, and I am delegate of New Zealand. Our question is, how would you describe observer position of the European Union in the UN, and does the cooperation among the European Union states at the UN bring some achievements so far? Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. I will begin with the question of my Austrian compatriot, although he doesn't represent Austria here today, because that is, of course, the philosophy of your meeting on the very difficult situation that we're facing with Ukraine. And I basically think that what we're seeing is, up to a certain point, a return to some of the patterns of behavior that we experienced in the times of the Cold War. And it is certainly disquieting. And it is certainly disquieting that methods are used, including military pressure, military aggression, to change borders, because that is basically what has happened in the case of Crimea. It's one thing to have a referendum, but it's another thing to have this referendum under the conditions and with the prehistory of this specific referendum. I think the great difference between the Cold War and now is the much greater interdependence of various countries in the world. And I do think that while we've seen in the recent days also messages from the Russian president where he clearly tried to use the leverage of Russia as a great provider of natural gas to countries in the region, in particular also to Ukraine. We also know that it's true that Russia is the greatest provider of natural gas for many countries in Europe. For our common home country, for instance, some 80% of the natural gas that we import comes from Russia. But we, on the other hand, are also the most important clients of the Russian Federation, and it's not something that can be changed from one day to the other. And that's why I think that there is a need for both sides to cooperate, and there will, as you know, be a meeting on Thursday, a meeting of Ukraine, of Russia, of the United States, of the European Union, represented by High Representative Ashton, and we can only hope that this leads to dialogue. I think that while some patterns of behavior remind us of the past, the circumstances have changed fundamentally, especially through economic dependence, and we hope that people will understand this message. But on the other hand, as you know, the European Union has taken a number of measures, sanctions against Russia under the circumstances. We are calling for de-escalation. We have made it perfectly clear that there can only be a political solution to the problem, but if escalation continues, the European Union is prepared to look at further sanctions, and you know that foreign ministers of the European Union are meeting tomorrow in Luxembourg, and they will certainly also discuss this issue. Migration is one of the greatest challenges of our times, and the messages we've heard from many, including from Pope Francis, have been very impressive on this subject. It is clear that something needs to be done about migration. It is also clear that everybody who is a political refugee who seeks asylum must find asylum in Europe. On the other hand, it is also clear that the European Union cannot solve on its territory all the woes of the world, economic woes of the world, especially also in a period that is economically difficult for us. And that's why I think that one of the most proactive forms of trying to get to grips with migration challenges is helping the countries from which migrants originate. And that is one of the reasons why the European Union is the greatest provider of development aid in the world, together with its member states, and why we are engaged in trying to do peace building and peacekeeping in some of the conflict areas in Africa from which many of these migrants come. But it's a problem that we haven't solved and for which we still have to seek new answers. And then finally, you've asked me how the European Union works at the United Nations and what we could do to increase our cooperation. It's a challenge, I can tell you. We are 28 member states with a long tradition of being represented at the United Nations, many of them proud founding members of these organizations, and evidently they will continue to have their missions and their embassies here because it's one of the places in the world, the only place in the world where you can meet really everyone, 194 member states of the United Nations. At the same time, it is also clear that we have to work together to be able to speak with one voice, because if member states contribute, as I already said, 37% to the budget, you will only leverage this influence if you speak with one voice. And in addition, the European Union has quite a number of aligning countries, friends, candidate countries, who also support it. So it's very hard, continuous coordination. I told you about these 1,000 meetings per year that we have, and probably, as is the case with these processes, we spend more time, I certainly, speaking with my own colleagues and speaking amongst ourselves than speaking with the outside world. And when we finally established a common position, it is sometimes difficult to change it because it was so complicated to establish this position. And I don't know, it will be interesting in your simulation activities how much this reality will be reflected in your activities, because in reality, I understand that 2 of my colleagues will meet member states representatives of the European Union here tomorrow and tell you how it works in the European Union, because once you've come up with a common position, you're meant to stick to it and speak with one voice. It doesn't always happen, it doesn't always work, and it's complicated by the fact that the member states are members and the European Union as such is an observer at the organization, and having the voice of 28 members represented by an observer is also a daily challenge, but we try to cope with it. I would be happy to take another group of questions.
Good evening, and thank you for this opportunity. My name is Megan Kudelka, and I'm a delegate from the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth, representing the Republic of Latvia, and we would graciously like to ask this question. How can the Security Council better resolve situations like the one in Syria, where members disagree on different approaches, which results in a prolonged response towards a solution?
Your Excellency, it is a pleasure to be here to ask you a question. As we all know, one of the biggest issues encountered in treaties process isn't their creation, but their implementation. My question would be, how could we, as young leaders from all over the world, encourage political implementation of the work done in the UN, and more precisely, what should be our action against the crimes that oppressive governments are taking with their own people, taking as example the situation in Venezuela or in Syria? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Timothy Koch. I'm from Manhattan College, and I'm representing the Republic of Zimbabwe. And my question for you was, how do you think the European Union can strengthen its position and continue to become an even more important force in the world? And how does the European Union maximize its influence on the day-to-day workings of the United Nations? Thank you.
Well, my name is Michael, and I was a delegate 20 years ago. And I'd be interested in you sharing with these young leaders what your greatest challenge has been as a diplomat, if you would be so gracious, Your Excellency.
That was, of course, an unfair one at the very end. Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, what can the Security Council do? The Security Council has the prime responsibility in the world for the maintenance of international peace and security. And I have to say, it is evident that the permanent members of the Security Council who have veto power have a qualified responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. And it always becomes problematic if a permanent member of the Security Council does not want to work through and with the Security Council. And to be frank, we've had these experiences in a number of cases over time with different permanent members of the Security Council. In this given situation, the situation in Syria is dramatic. What we're seeing is an extremely bloody civil war, is a bloodbath, is crimes against humanity. We, the Security Council, I believe and I'm convinced, will discuss in the very next days the issue of whether the situation in Syria should be referred to the International Criminal Court. But at the end of the day, if a permanent member of the Security Council, and in this case it is primarily Russia, uses its veto power to prevent decisions in the Council, under the system of the Charter, the Security Council is blocked. And the Security Council has to return over and over again to these issues. And it is only by pressure, public pressure, international pressure, that some progress can be achieved. And the progress that has been achieved so far is very limited. There have been some positive developments, as you know, in Syria on the destruction of chemical weapons. There, I think the goal of removing chemical weapons from the country will be achieved, perhaps a little belatedly, and after a terrible tragedy there as well. But this happened under the pressure of the Security Council, and the Security Council has also done some work in helping humanitarians to have additional access to the most affected areas. But this is little in comparison with what is happening. And I have to say that Syria is one of the most desperate situations we're facing with, and we can only continue to put pressure on the members of the Security Council through public opinion, through all the political means at our disposal. But I have to be honest, there's no immediate answer that I can give you today, and then others will be able to give you in the days to come. When it comes to implementation, I think the first issue is that we have to hold our own governments accountable, because governments accept international obligations, be it in the framework of the United Nations, be it also in the framework of an organization like the European Union, and it's then up to them to implement these obligations. And this will be an essential issue when we speak about sustainable development goals, when we speak about climate change, when we speak about the protection of human rights and many other issues. And I know, of course, although some of you represent Zimbabwe here, that you will not have to forward this message to the government of Zimbabwe, but to your own governments, where some of the challenges are not comparable to those of your friends who live in a country like Zimbabwe or in others that you have mentioned, or in Syria. But again, I think it is the message of meetings like this, it is the union that comes from meetings like this, it is the understanding that the values that you defend here are universal, that can help. And evidently, you can try all you can do to make things better in comparison with the many lacunae and the many mistakes we have been in the past. And I think that in a certain sense, modern media, social media, Facebook, Twitter, and all these other possibilities that we have today have created a possibility of exchange and a possibility of communication that didn't exist in the past. And if you look, for instance, at the experience of the Arab Spring, and part of the Arab Spring has regrettably gone awry again, or this would not have happened without modern media, modern communication, and the kind of links that are forged in meetings like this today and in the days to come. How can the European Union maximize its efficiency, maximize acting together? There was one European politician, it was Jean-Paul Spaak, a Belgian politician, who once said, in the Europe of today, there are only medium-sized powers anymore, but not all have found it out yet. And that is probably something that is still true today, with the challenges that we're facing in the world today. Even major international players, even permanent members of the Security Council, like the United Kingdom or France, even big economic powers like the Federal Republic of Germany, need a cooperation within the European Union to enhance the leverage we all have together. And clearly, if we work together, if we work with one voice, we will be more effective than we can on an everyday basis. And in a certain sense, that is my answer to the last question. That is my greatest challenge, and that is my everyday challenge, to make this work and to achieve this effect with my partners from the European Union here at the United Nations. I've had other challenges in the course of my professional career. When I was a political director of Austria, we had the presidency of the European Union, and we were faced with the so-called cartoons crisis, when there was an outrage in the Muslim world because of cartoons that were considered as insulting to the Prophet Muhammad. And there was this whole issue of how to cope with the freedom of expression on the one side and respect for religion. And it's a discussion that we have all the time and all along. It's a discussion that you know. But in a certain sense, and with that I will close, the greatest challenge I've ever faced is probably speaking to this group here tonight, the biggest group I've ever spoken to. Thank you very much.